Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 44, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. I'm back after a week off. I needed a week off. There was a lot going on. It's the middle of the summer. We're at the end of July 2024, but it has been an eventful couple of weeks with quite a bit of sewing in it, actually, or sewing related things. So today's episode is going to be a catch-up episode, a little visit about what I've been up to, and looking forward to where I'm going to go with the podcast in the fall. I'm coming up on a year anniversary of doing the podcast, and I want to talk a little bit about the direction that I'm thinking of going. So with that introduction, let's jump right in. If you've been listening to the podcast for any length of time, you know that I belong to a sewing group that meets at our local community center every Thursday. And a couple of years ago, I came up with this bright idea that we would all go on a retreat, or those of us in the group who wanted to go on a retreat. And I found a place in Spokane that I thought would be fun for a group of us, maybe half a dozen, to go and hang out for a few days where we could sew or work on art projects and do a little bit of shopping. It would give us a little bit of perspective being in a different place. But as you can imagine, trying to coordinate the schedules of 6 different people was virtually impossible. Summer here is just crammed full of stuff because it only lasts for about 2 months. So everything needs to get scheduled into a short period of time, whether that's fundraisers that we're having or vacations. Typically, a lot of people get company during the summer. So that retreat idea kind of fell off the radar for a while. But it looked like we might be able to coordinate at least a couple of us. So I asked my friends Robin and Sunny, who are both in the Thursday sewing group, if they wanted to go over to Spokane for a couple of days, and they enthusiastically agreed to do that. So I found us an Airbnb. My younger daughter graduated from Gonzaga in 2019. I've spent enough time in Spokane that I know it almost as well as I know Kalispell. So I know where to find the great places to stay, the great places to eat, and I offered to coordinate all of that for the 3 of us. Robin sews. She does a lot of quilting. Sunny is not a sewist, but she is a nationally known painter here in the United States, and she especially likes to go to thrift stores because she likes to look for frames for her paintings. She always finds really nice ones for her paintings, and so we look around here, but when we're traveling, I took her to Missoula one time with me, and we looked down there for frames for her paintings, and I thought she'd probably have a lot of success in Spokane. The 3 of us left on a Wednesday morning a couple of weeks ago. There are only really 2 ways to get to Spokane from Kalispell. Part of that is because in Montana, there aren't very many roads. There are a lot of mountains that you have to go around. So the number of ways to get anywhere is far fewer than you would imagine. Normally, I will drive south to pick up I-90 and then head west to Spokane. That's also how I get to Seattle. There's another way to go, which is what I call the northern route, and it goes west from Kalispell, actually northwest, up to a town called Libby, and then over into the very northern panhandle of Idaho, not very far from the Canadian border. It's only probably about 25 or 30 miles from the Canadian border, where you pick up Highway 95 and you take that south through Bonner's Ferry and Sandpoint, and it hits Coeur d'Alene, which is just to the east of Spokane. And there we pick up I-90 and head into Spokane. And I like that route. It's The two routes actually differ in mileage only by about 2 or 3 miles. The northern route takes a little bit longer because it's not an interstate. But I like that route because there are some very cool antique and thrift stores along the way. And I have bought Necky sewing machines on that route. I have bought aprons, apron patterns. I have found all sorts of very cool things. So I like to go that route because it's a big adventure. It took us most of Wednesday to meander our way over to Spokane. Sunny did find some frames at a couple of the stores, and we pulled into the Airbnb about 4 or 5 in the afternoon, got settled, went out to dinner, and I suggested that we wait until Thursday morning to go to the big quilt store in Spokane because you really need to go there when you're fresh, and you really need to go there with a list because otherwise it's too easy to get overwhelmed. So we got a good night's sleep, and Thursday morning we had a hearty breakfast. I had brought eggs from our chickens. Robin brought sausage. I cooked breakfast for all of us. And around 9 o'clock, we headed out. I gave Sunny and Robin a quick tour of Spokane, and then we headed over to the Quilting Bee. The Quilting Bee is an amazing store. I remember this was back, 2014, 2015, I went to Spokane for a long weekend by myself, and the Quilting Bee was still in a smaller store in a strip mall. And it was clear from that location that they had just outgrown it. Everything was kind of crammed in there. It was really hard to get around. I remember I walked around in there and I knocked over a thread stand and all the thread came tumbling down and I was really embarrassed. But it was just very tight in that little store. And we were all very excited when the owners announced that they had purchased a piece of property and were going to build a custom quilt store about maybe a mile or two east of their current location. That store opened in 2016, I believe, and it's huge. It looks like a very large red barn. That was how they designed it. It's got a large central area with classrooms off to one side, and there's kind of a loft type walkway around the upper part of it. And that's where they hang the quilts that they have on display. And I think that's where most of their offices are. They've got an area in the back for their sewing machine techs to work on sewing machines. And it's quite the operation. If you are ever anywhere near Spokane, it is definitely a must-see destination. They also do a live stream every Wednesday on YouTube. And I do believe they do mail order, so if there's something that you're looking for, that might be a good place to check if you're having trouble. The Quilting Bee is also a Bernina and Janome and Baby Lock dealer. There is a Juki dealer that's another smaller store in Spokane, and that's typically where I teach. I haven't taught at the Quilting Bee. They've got a stable of teachers that offer regular classes there. I have taken some classes there. I took an Angela Walters free motion quilting class there a couple years ago, which I enjoyed very much. Even though my friend Sunny doesn't sew, she's a very good sport. And the minute she walked into the Quilting Bee, she got a little shopping cart and disappeared. And the next time I saw her, the shopping cart was full of about half a dozen bolts of fabric. Sunny really likes rabbits. So she corralled one of the salespeople and asked her to show her where all the rabbit fabric was. And Sunny pulled all the bolts off and put them in her cart. Sunny is also very good at roping those of us who do so into making things for her. I made her an apron a couple years ago, and she often gets Robin to make table runners and placemats and things for her house. So she picked out a selection of fabrics, and Robin agreed to make her some placemats. Robin, on the other hand, does sew, and she's very organized. She comes with swatches of fabric from each of her current projects if she needs to match something. And she systematically goes around and pulls fabrics and picks things so that she can finish her projects. And so that's what she was busy doing. I chose to concentrate on getting some bag hardware and zippers and some faux leather because I'm still trying to scratch this bag making itch. I haven't been very successful. It's been a couple of weeks. Things just keep getting in the way, but I'm bound and determined to do some of that. So that's what I bought there. And I also bought a fat quarter bundle of Tim Holtz's new line called Laboratory. I actually bought the fat quarter bundle that the store had curated, and then I asked them if they could cut me another fat quarter bundle because I didn't think one fat quarter bundle would be enough. That fat quarter bundle only had 6 fabrics in it. So one of the salespeople and I went and pulled the other 6 bolts, and she very kindly cut another 6 fat quarters for me. And so I ended up with 2 fat quarter bundles of Tim Holtz fabric. I really like Tim Holtz. I don't do much scrapbooking. I don't do any scrapbooking, but I do love his fabric lines, and I buy basically everything of his that comes out. A few years ago, I had a couple of fat quarter bundles of one of his lines. I can't remember the name of it, but I made a quilt for my father-in-law who lives in Colorado, and we all laughed because I sent him the quilt via UPS, and he called my husband, and he said, I opened up the package and I took the quilt out and I laid down in my recliner and covered myself with the quilt, and the next thing I knew, it was the next morning. So we call that the magic quilt because he slept all night under it in his recliner. After we left the Quilting Bee, I took Robin and Sunny to Value Village. There is a chain of thrift stores in Washington State called Value Village. They have them in Seattle. I've been to those, and I always go to the ones in Spokane. They have a tendency to put sewing machines out that are not very expensive. So if I go to Goodwill and find a sewing machine, it might be $59, $60, $70. I've picked up very nice Janome sewing machines that I use when I teach at our community center. I teach beginning sewing. We make pillowcases. I pick up Janome sewing machines at Value Village for $15. And they're always tested and clean, and I know that they'll be a good buy. So we walked into Value Village, and again, Sunny took a cart and disappeared. She went in search of frames. And Robin and I walked over to the electronics section where they typically display the sewing machines, and I think I let out a small yelp or a squeal. I made some noise of joy because on the shelf was a serger, and not just any serger. It was a Baby Lock Vibrant, and those are still available. They run about $400. It's a good entry-level serger, and it was on the shelf with a price tag of $13.99. So I scooped it up and deposited it in the cart, and we practically raced to the checkout so that I could get it. I have plenty of sergers. I have my entry-level Juki, which I still have, the 654 DE. I have a white Speedy Lock that I picked up at a thrift store a couple years ago, and I gave it to a friend of mine to use, but she hated it. And truly, it is the hardest serger I have ever had to thread. I really wouldn't wish it on any of my enemies because it, even for me who's so familiar with sergers, it's a terrible machine to thread. I still have it. I have an industrial Juki, and I've got my Bernina L860. So I don't need any more sergers, but for $13.99, I thought I can give this to somebody who can't afford even an entry-level serger. So you'll hear more about where that machine ended up a little bit later in the podcast. Sunny was busy, and I didn't get to the fabric section before she did, and she came up to me with a bolt of fabric in her cart. She had snagged an entire bolt, full 10-yard bolt of Alexander Henry fabric with vintage cowboy faces on it. And she later gifted it to me because she doesn't sew. And she said, you'll have to find something interesting to make with this. So it might end up as a quilt back. It might end up as some aprons. It might end up as some quilted bags. There are lots of things that I could do with that fabric, but that was Sunny's score at Value Village. And between the two of us, we were pretty happy with ourselves because I had found the serger and she had found the fabric. We did a little bit more shopping in Spokane. That was about the last of our fabric shopping. We didn't make it to the small quilt store in Spokane. We actually went in the other direction. We came back to the Airbnb in the afternoon and rested for a little bit, and then we went out to dinner at Luna, which is one of my favorite restaurants. My kids found that restaurant when the two of them were living in Spokane, and it is my favorite place to eat. So we enjoyed a very nice meal there. And on Friday morning, we got up and we hit a few more places on the way out of town, and then we headed back to Kalispell. So it was a fun trip. I don't know that it qualifies as a retreat. We didn't actually do any sewing. Neither of us, neither Robin nor I took our sewing machines with us, but it was good to get away for a few days. And we had a good time together. This past week was really busy for me. So between the trip to Spokane and the classes that I taught last week, that was part of the reason I decided to take a week off from a podcast episode, because I just did not know where I was going to shoehorn that into the schedule. The garden is starting to produce. My husband picked 2 gallons of raspberries the other day. I picked the first zucchini. It's going to be a tsunami here before too long. On Monday evening, I taught a class at the quilting store in Kalispell. I don't typically teach evening classes. That's not my best time of day. But there are people who really only can take evening classes. And so I try to schedule 1 or 2 every summer when it stays light out really late and I don't have to worry about driving home in the dark and hitting a deer. So we had 4 students in the class, 4 ladies, one of whom was the quilt store owner. She really, really wanted to take the class. One of the side effects of owning a quilt store or a fabric store is that your sewing time virtually disappears. So there were 4 of us who are all basically about the same age, and then one young woman in her early 20s who's an absolute darling, and she's just fearless. The first time I met her was last year at Bernina demo days when I was doing serger demos, and she went around and did every demo at every station because she just wants to learn. And I was sitting there next to the quilt store owner, and we kind of had our heads together, and the quilt store owner said to me, if you're looking for someone to give that serger to that you bought in Spokane, this young lady would be a good candidate. And not only did she complete the first top in the class that we planned to make, but by the end of the class, she was already cutting out a second top. That's how excited she was to be able to make something for herself. So I didn't bring the serger with me. I wanted to play around with it a little bit and make sure that it was threaded properly and was working correctly. So I knew that they were having a Krista Moser workshop that week at the quilt store. So my class was Monday night and the Krista Moser workshop started on Wednesday. And I also knew that this young woman was going to be at the workshop. So I made plans with myself to bring the serger to the store when I knew she would be there so that I could give it to her. So that was Monday night. And the top that we made in the class was the Déclic top from Atelier Scamie. It's a free pattern, and I'll put the link to it. I've made a couple of these. I think I've made 4 of them actually. They're wonderful if you make them out of a woven rayon fabric to wear when it's 95 degrees out because they're just real loose and breezy. All 4 of the students in the class completed their tops by the end, and we had a little modeling session. The quilt store owner also let me know that the used 880 that I'm buying or that I bought would be ready for me that week. So I filed that little piece of information away, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. On Wednesday, Robin and I left bright and early, about 6:45, to drive down to Missoula. It's about a 2-hour drive, but the last time I went, it took me almost 2.5 hours. And I was scheduled to teach a class there beginning at 10. So we left a little bit early just in case we hit tourist traffic or road construction. And actually, it took us about 10 minutes less than 2 hours to get down there because there wasn't very much traffic on the roads. And the road construction is pretty much, there wasn't a lot of it, amazingly, on the way down there. So that was good. We got to Missoula a little bit early. We went to Joann Fabrics and checked out the remnant rack there. And then we headed to A Clean Stitch, which is where I teach when I'm in Missoula. And that store is the Bernina and Janome dealer. And the reason Robin went with me was because she bought a new Janome machine from them back earlier in the spring. And she needed to take a mastery class on it to learn some of the features. And she also thought it needed some adjustments. So while I was teaching, she was working with the tech on learning the features of the machine, and he actually did have to take it in the back and make a few adjustments for her. I had 4 students in my thread class. I was teaching my Wonderfill thread class. So I'm a Wonderfill educator, and Wonderfill is a thread company headquartered in Canada. They've got 36 different lines of thread. I happen to think they're fabulous threads. And their teacher coordinator and I put this class together last year when I said to her that I thought this would be a good way to get people used to or educate people about the different kinds of threads and what their uses are. So I've taught this already once at the quilt store here in Kalispell, and I taught it down in Missoula last week, and I'll be teaching it again at the end of August here in Kalispell. And I'm kicking around the idea of maybe offering it as a class at Sew Expo next year. The Sew Expo teacher coordinator sent out an email and asked for more teaching proposals. So I'm going to submit a few teaching proposals, and I talked to the teacher coordinator at Wonderfill, and she thought that this might be a good fit. So I think I'm going to submit it as a class proposal to Sew Expo. Basically, Wonderfill puts together thread kits for me that have 6 different threads in them of different weights, of different kinds, different fiber content. So we start at the upper end with the thinner threads and we work our way down. And I have the students do some stitch outs and try a few other things so that they can put the thread through its paces. They can see how their machines like it. It's a fun class. I enjoy teaching it, and I think the students have a good time too. So I did that from 10 to 1 while Robin was getting her machine checked out. And then we headed to downtown Missoula to one of our favorite restaurants called Notorious PIG, where they have fabulous barbecue. And it just happens to be a block away from the Confident Stitch, which is another one of my favorite stores in Missoula. Kate McIver, the owner, was a guest on the podcast a couple of months ago. And I walked in and I just happened to have on a declique top that I made from a remnant of fabric that I bought at the Confident Stitch. So I thought that was kind of fun to be able to walk in and show Kate that I was wearing something made from fabric that I bought there. I bought another remnant and a Creative Grids ruler that I needed, the 1.5 inch by 12 inch. And we got back in the car and headed up north toward Kalispell, stopping for ice cream at the Amish store about halfway home, and then also stopping at another quilt store. This is another small quilt store in Ronan, Montana, and it's in a tiny, tiny little space, and they're outgrowing it by leaps and bounds, but it's in a strip mall, and they can't get any additional space in that strip mall. So it's very tight in there, but the owner has a wonderful selection of fabrics. And I found some more Tim Holtz fabric. This fabric that I got was from his Abandoned line. So the fabric I got in Spokane was from the Laboratory line, and this is from Abandoned. I got a couple of yards of 2 different prints, and I brought those home, and I'll put those in the stash. On Thursday, I sat down with the serger that I bought at Value Village, and I threaded it up and tested it out, and it serges beautifully. It's fairly easy to thread. There's a few idiosyncrasies, but I got it figured out, and I put the serger and all the accessories that came with it and the manual into my car, and I headed into town to the quilt store. There were probably a dozen students in the Krista Moser class, and each of them was working on a different pattern. So I walked around and admired some of the projects that people were working on, and then I went over to the young woman who had been in my top class on Monday night, and I said, "Can you come out to the car with me for a couple of minutes?" And it was a good stopping point for her, so she came out to the car, and I said, "Here's a serger for you. I hope that you will put it to good use." And she was very excited, and I was thrilled to be able to find a good home for it. I know that she is going to use it. She does Ren Fair, and I know she makes a lot of costumes, and I can't wait to see the projects that she makes with it. While I was there, I also picked up my new to me Bernina 880. So you may know that most of the large machine companies are coming out with new top-of-the-line machines. Bernina just released the 990 in June, and it's top-of-the-line machine. The price tag on it is about $23,000. That is a bit more than I'm willing to spend on a sewing machine at this point in my life. I am not judging anybody who chooses to purchase that machine. It is a phenomenal machine. And if you have the budget to do that, more power to you. I hope you have hours and hours of wonderful sewing on that machine. That just wasn't the machine that I wanted to get, but our store owner said that she was getting a lot of 880s in trade. And when the sewing machine tech from that store came out in April to service my Bernina Q20, he and I were chatting about sewing machines while he was working on my Q20, and he had some very positive things to say about that model from an engineering and design standpoint. He didn't know that I'm at that time I wasn't thinking about getting one, so it wasn't that he was trying to sell me one. He was just telling me what his thoughts were about that machine, and he had a lot of positive things to say about it. He was also very honest and said that there were some end user issues, primarily with threading. It does have some threading idiosyncrasies, but I knew that going in, and the store owner was selling the used 880s at an excellent price. So I was getting a machine that was far more machine than I ever imagined owning, and it was at a price that I was very comfortable paying. As it turns out, the owner of the model that I got, the owner of the 880 that I bought, happened to be one of my students from my Monday's Day Clique Top class. So that was really cool because I know that woman and I know that she took great care of that machine. The store also goes over all the trade-in models with a fine-tooth comb before they send them home with their new owners. So I brought the machine home being confident that it was going to be in good shape, it would perform the way it was supposed to, and I wouldn't have any surprises. I've been watching quite a few videos on YouTube about the 880. So I was prepared for the threading idiosyncrasies, and the first time I threaded it, I did thread it incorrectly, which was a great learning experience. Now I know how not to thread it. And the second time I was able to thread it with no problems. It's a fabulous machine. It came with probably half a dozen presser feet, but I've got another half a dozen on my wish list that I will be picking up over the next couple of months. I like everything about it, and I expect that machine and I will have a long and happy relationship. Over this past weekend, I decided to tear apart my entire sewing area. Things have not been flowing efficiently in my workspace. I don't have one dedicated room. My husband laughs. He says that I have taken over the entire upstairs of the house, which is true, and he asks periodically if I'm going to kick him out of our bedroom. I said I wasn't planning to kick him out of our bedroom, but it did cross my mind that we could move into one of the smaller bedrooms and make our large bedroom the sewing room, but I decided that wouldn't work for a variety of reasons. So I'm just renovating the other 3 bedrooms. We had a bedroom for each of our daughters and a spare bedroom. Last year, I took the bed out of my younger daughter's bedroom because that's where I have my large cutting table. But we still had a bed in the spare bedroom and a bed in my older daughter's room. I'm going to leave the bed in my older daughter's room because it's a full-size bed, and occasionally we do get people who come to stay here, but not very often. I think probably a year ago was the last time we had anybody staying here. So I decided that the bed needed to come out of the spare bedroom, so I took it apart and I bought some wire shelving units to put in there. Part of the issue that I'm having is that I can't see what I've got. And when I can't see what I've got, I'm frustrated because I can't find it. And I run the risk of going out and buying things that I already have. Supplies also tend to get buried in closets. I know I have a lot of ripstop nylon for making shopping totes and things like that, but I have to take apart an entire closet to find it. So I've got 2 wire shelves up right now. I spent this morning doing that. I'm locating and consolidating supplies and putting them in labeled bins and putting things on the shelving. So the Bernina 880 came with a large piece of luggage. It came with a very large rolling tote, which is great, but I doubt I'm ever going to take that machine out of the house. So the rolling tote for that machine is on the very top of a shelf that I don't access very often. I can get to it if I need it, but it's out of the way. So I'm in the process of doing that, and I'm hoping that once all of that is done, my workflow will be a bit more efficient, and I'll have all the supplies that I need near the machines where I need them. I'll be able to pull my bin of bag making notions off of the shelf and have everything in there that I need instead of spread around in 3 or 4 different places. That's going to be an ongoing process that'll take a couple more days, but I've made a lot of progress and I'm really happy about it. So that is the sewing news for my life. As I mentioned earlier in the podcast, we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of the podcast. The first episode came out on September 12th last year. This podcast the idea for it came out of the clear blue sky. I don't know if you've listened to the intro episode where I talked about my husband and I had taken our pigs down to a processor that's about 80 miles south of here, and we had some difficulties with this processor. They changed the date on us twice last summer, and the second time we took the pigs down there, they actually weren't even there. And we lost one of the pigs because it was a really hot day and pigs don't do well in heat when they're being transported. So we started out with 8 pigs and ended up with 7. and we ended up having to find a different processor for the pigs. And that was one of those days when I was feeling kind of demoralized about what we were doing here. And I happened to be driving into town listening to Nicole Sauce, who hosts the Living Free in Tennessee Homesteading podcast. And she's one of my favorite podcasters. I have listened to her for over 8 years now. She's got great content. And she was talking about failing homesteaders of the internet. And she was talking about how not everything about homesteading is glamorous, even though, people who do content creation on YouTube and Instagram try to make it seem easy and all, unicorns and rainbows and things like that. And just then, out of the clear blue sky, it hit me that I needed to do a podcast. There are a lot of homesteading podcasts. I could talk for hours about homesteading. We've been doing it here for 30 years, but I decided to do a sewing podcast instead, and it has been a great deal of fun. I have interviewed some really fascinating people, and I hope to keep bringing you some really fascinating interviews in the months to come. I may go to an every other week schedule. The every week schedule is a little bit tough to keep up with, but I'm still thinking about that. And if you have any input, I'd love to hear from you. The podcast has a website at www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com. You can leave comments there. The show notes for each episode are there. You can email me at janet@janetzabo.com. www.janetzabo.com is my personal website, and that has links to my blog where I post a lot of pictures about the garden and the homestead and my sewing projects. And it also has a link to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website. The podcast is hosted at Buzzsprout, and Buzzsprout has the fan mail feature. So if you see that on your download, you can give immediate feedback directly to Buzzsprout for each podcast. Unfortunately, I can't respond to the fan mail input. So if you want to have a conversation or you want a response, probably best to email me. And again, that's janet@janetzabo.com. JANETSZ as in zebra, ABO.com. I think this is plenty for this week. I'm going to go continue to chip away at my sewing area reorganization. And eventually, I hope that you and I will both get to go sew something.